It's Marc Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also Marc Zicree of Space Command, and Marc Zicree of Twilight Zone Companion, and Star Trek The Next Generation, and Deep Space Nine, and Sliders, and Smurfs, and on and on and on. You know me and what I've been up to. I'm continuing now on my history of science fiction. I was on James Cameron's TV show a little while back, and it gave me the idea to do my own history of science fiction because I know so much about the subject and have lived through so much of it. And so the first section, which is a pretty long section, will be on books. Second section is on film. Third section will be on radio and television. So now we had gotten to sort of the mid 60s. I was talking about Dangerous Visions when we last convened, but I want to back up a little because thinking back on what I'd been talking about and reviewing it, I realized there's certain things I hadn't mentioned that I did want to mention because as you know, science fiction has an illustrious history, and first of all, because of Wells, science fiction writers through most of the 20th century were writing in several different established subgenres of science fiction. So there was the space exploration novels that Heinlein, I mean, basically all the major science fiction writers were writing all of these subgenres. They would just kind of trade off in their short stories and in their novels, and they were all of them writing both very effectively because there were so many science fiction magazines and also book publishers. And so throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, you had them exploring turf that had been first explored by Verne and then Wells. And so you had essentially, off of Wells, you had space exploration story, the alien invasion story, the experiments gone awry story, and that of course goes all the way back to Mary Shelley with Frankenstein. And finally, you had the time travel story that Wells had originated with the time machine. And now there was also sort of a dystopian kind of story. You got this in science fiction and much more when we had nuclear war and the threat of nuclear war. But you had a dystopian air and an end of the world air in science fiction almost from the beginning. So, for instance, Mary Shelley wrote a story called The Last Man about the last man on Earth, and Jack London wrote The Scarlet Plague, and there was another book written around the Victorian era about London falling to ruin, and I think it was called After London, but then, of course, that really got going as a theme once we got into an actively technological society. So I wanted to touch on those things. And then there was one other subgenre of science fiction that was not created by Werner Wells, but by Murray Leinster, another science fiction writer who in the 1930s wrote a story called Sidewise in Time. And that was positing the notion of parallel Earths, other dimensions that had other Earths that had different, either slightly different or extremely different variant histories. And science fiction writers wrote a lot about those kind of stories, alternate history stories. Harry Turtledove does that nowadays. Certainly I did it when I was producing and writing for Sliders. But we'll get into all of that as we continue. So let's swing back for a moment to the 30s and the 20s. There was a writer named, and the other thing, by the way, in terms of space exploration, some writers were content to do something in the near future. For instance, 1965 felt like a very futuristic year for me because when I was a kid reading science fiction that had been written in the late 40s through the 50s, a lot of the science fiction writers were positing that 1965 would be the year we landed on the moon. Now, it was actually 1969, but that wasn't that bad. And science fiction through the earlier part of the 20th century into, say, the early 60s was largely optimistic, and the generation of that period, Arthur C. Clarke, Heinlein, Asimov, Bradbury, they were all, and all the other writers under them, were basically writing an optimistic view of the future in which we land on the moon, we colonize Mars, we go out to the stars. It was basically very hopeful and forward-looking and working hand in hand with the rocket scientists to create that future. And science fiction now has, I think, a very different role by and large. And so we'll talk about that. But back in so some writers were writing space exploration in the near decades as we colonized the Mars and landed on the moon and so forth. But others had a long view where they wanted to write about thousands or millions or billions of years. And so there was a writer named Olaf Stapleton who wrote a book called Last and First Men that was a very long-term book in terms of its view and its scale. And then following on upon Stapleton's heels, there was a writer named E. Doc Smith, and he wrote Skylark of Space and the Lensman series, and this is the issue of Astounding that has the Gray Lensman, and you can see it's a great cover, great science fiction cover. And not long after, Fantasy Press published this. This is the first edition of that story in book form. Pretty cool. And so E. Doc Smith wrote big scale stories all across the galaxy and big adventures, space adventures, and he was extremely forward thinking in that way, and a lot of and so he was primarily writing 30s, 40s, 50s into the 60s, and a lot of the science fiction writers who loved epic scale adventures really loved his work, and he was an inspiration on Asimov, as was Olaf Stapleton, when Asimov was doing the Foundation series, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, we also talked about end of the world stories, and one of the really good ones that was later made into a movie, and we'll talk about that in our movie section of the history of science fiction, is this. It's When Worlds Collide by Philip Wiley and Edwin Ballmer, and this is a very fun book, and it was made into a great movie by George Pal. This is the first edition with Dust Jacket, and it's got a great scene of like people watching as a planet collides with the Earth and destroys, and it's about the survivors who have to build a spaceship and get off Earth before it is destroyed. So very fun stuff. Now, we also talked in the previous installment about writers who were writing science fiction, but they were primarily not science fiction writers and not perceived as science fiction writers. One of these was, writing in the 40s, was C.S. Lewis, who was a friend and fellow dean at Oxford with J.R.R. Tolkien, and he wrote a trilogy. He was a Catholic, and he would write science fiction to kind of explore Catholic themes and kind of cloak his writing in science fictional tropes. And so he wrote a trilogy, which was That Hideous Strength and Paralandra, and one other, which the title eludes me for the moment, but I'm sure my fans will correct me. But those books were very successful, and some people really liked them. Others were a little bit put off by his dogma. And so now also, science fiction and fantasy were very, parallel track kind of genres. And many of the science fiction writers were also writing fantasy and vice versa, though some stuck to their own little corner of the ring. So, for instance, Tolkien wrote fantasy, and but others have crossed both sides of the street. And also, many science fiction writers also wrote mysteries, and some, like L. Ron Hubbard, would write everything. They were writing westerns and mysteries and science fiction and romance stories and anything that the pulps would publish. And often they were writing under a number of pseudonyms, and so it's kind of a fun game to research those pseudonyms and track down some of their stories written under nom de plumes. And so, but meantime, we also talked about comic books and the fact that comic books in the late 30s and beyond started also using the tropes of science fiction, and so this was a very, very interesting period, and and comics and science fiction novels and short stories really started to cross-fertilize, and some of the writers were writing for both, and so that became very, very interesting. Now, oh, by the way, I mentioned previously that if you want to support Mr. Sci-Fi and continue these videos, I have a Patreon page that I've set up. It's patreon.com/Marc Zicree, and you can throw, $10 or $20 a month my way, or 100 or 1,000, whatever works for you. But that keeps this going and makes it much easier to do ongoingly. So it's just because I'm not drawing a salary from Space Command, probably foolishly, but I wanted to keep my hands clean and have all the money go into production. But Mr. Sci-Fi, different story. You want to throw some bucks my way? Thanks, I appreciate it. So back to our story. So comic books. So Superman, of course, was one of the great science fiction comic books of all time. An alien comes to Earth. He's got amazing powers. Really, really fun, really terrific. But then in the 1950s, you also had comic strips, by the way, from the 1920s into the 1930s. You had Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, and they were later translated into film and TV and radio and all those things. And Alex Raymond drew Flash Gordon. He started as a fairly weak artist, but became a terrific artist, and I highly recommend his work. And Buck Rogers was less well drawn, but still a lot of fun. And Ray Bradbury was a huge fan of those as a kid and collecting them and reading them voraciously. And again, you can get a lot of fun out of them, though they are less scientifically accurate and a little more like Edgar Rice Burroughs in his Mars stories and so forth, a little more swashbuckling and less accurate as to real rocketry and all of that. But in the 50s, you got EC Comics, and they were doing a line of horror comics, and they were doing a line of science fiction comic books, and they had the top artists working for them, one of whom is Wally Wood, and this is an original EC comic cover, if you can see that, if you can make that out, and you can see, well, Wally Wood's artwork is terrific. Frank Frazetta also drew for them, Al Williamson, Joe Orlando, many wonderful artists, and it says Ray Bradbury in this issue, a story by Ray Bradbury. Now also this is signed by Ray to me, because Ray was my dear friend and mentor, but the way that came about was very, very funny, which was they were doing these science fiction stories, and at one point they ripped off two of Ray's stories, the Rocket Man and Kaleidoscope, and Ray, someone sent this to Ray, and he read it, and he had mixed feelings, because on the one hand he was being ripped off, but on the other hand he loved the adaptation. It was gorgeously drawn. I believe Wally Wood drew that, and so he wrote to William M. Gaines, the publisher of EC, and he said, I really love the adaptation you did of my stories, but you neglected to pay me or credit me. Now, Ray was already one of the top writers working in science fiction, if not the top writer, and this is in the early 50s. And William M. Gaines was clever, and he saw a great opportunity, so he said, well, here's a check for $50. Can we continue this relationship? And Ray said yes. And so they adapted many of his stories, some from the Martian Chronicles, some from other sources, and also some of his horror tales, because Ray also wrote fantasy and horror as well as science fiction, and also wrote mainstream stories too. So it became this wonderful collaboration. So EC did these great science fiction comic books through the 1950s, and they were very influential in terms of design in science fiction films, and I'm utilizing a lot of the design elements from EC Comics and some of the covers of the science fiction books and magazines for an aesthetic in Space Command. But so now as a lot of these writers that we're talking about now came to prominence in the late 40s into the 1950s and then in the 60s, and so another element of the doomsday story, the end of humanity story, the end of Earth story, when people were writing that before World War II, this was all speculative. It was all, imaginative, and there was no notion that we could actually destroy humanity and destroy this planet. That all changed, of course, at the end of World War II, when we developed the atom bomb and bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and all of a sudden. And then there became this race between Russia, the Soviet Union, and America, where thousands of nuclear missiles were produced. Essentially what happened was we developed the atom bomb. The Russians got those plans, ultimately, and started racing us to build bigger and bigger bombs, the hydrogen bomb and so forth. And at the same time, Hitler, a lot of these rocket enthusiasts, we talked about Robert Goddard in America and Tsiolkovsky in Russia, and then also in Germany there were Hermann Oberth and Willy Ley, and most importantly Wernher von Braun. Wernher von Braun was the head of the V-1 and V-2 rocket programs in World War II, and they would send these missiles over to England, and they'd have bombs, and then the missile would run out of fuel and crash on London or wherever else they were targeting, and the later V-2 rockets were so powerful they actually went into outer space in their parabola before they came down on London. And Wernher von Braun initially was in the SS. Actually, there are photos of him in his SS uniform, his Gestapo uniform, but at the end of the war, both the Russians and the Americans knew that there was going to be a race on for developing nuclear weapons, and so they both raced to get as many of these German scientists as they could. And there was an American secret program called Paperclip, and it was to bring these Nazi scientists, rocket scientists, into America and do it covertly and kind of whitewash them so they weren't Nazis. They became, Wernher von Braun particularly became one of the major scientists, both developing ICBM missiles for our nuclear defense and offense program, as well as adapt. But again, his real enthusiasm was space, and so he became a scientist working for NASA in the moon program, and he had actually worked out very detailed plans for how to get to Mars. And so he became a friend of people like Walt Disney, who would air TV shows with following Werner von Braun's ideas of how to go into space, and they were very well reasoned and very well worked out. But he was also meeting, Arthur C. Clarke and Bradbury and Heinlein and so forth, meeting these science fiction writers, and so there became basically this cross-fertilization between science and science fiction. We talked about that in the earlier chapter, but so we had after the bomb stories because we could now destroy the Earth for real, and that started.